the Southern Railway Q1 class. Okay, and right off the bat, I've already thrown everybody for a loop because what in the blue heck is that? This is by far one of the, well, squarest steam locomotives I've ever seen, and probably ever built. And some people may even go so far as to say that it's ugly, and that included some of the British crews that operated it. They took to calling it things like ugly ducklings or coffee pots, because it just looked so bizarre. But looks can be deceiving. Just like with the worst stuff list, where some locomotives look phenomenal and are awful, this one may look a little odd, but don't underestimate it. It was designed by Oliver Bulleid. Yes, that Bulleid. The same Bulleid that made the leader. And the thing about Ollie over here is that where Sir Gresley was more of a classic, contemporary, well-respected mechanical engineer, kind of the Einstein of his field with how much people respected what he did, Bulleid was more the Dr. Frankenstein aesthetic going on. The dude was a little eccentric with his design ethos. Now, he made plenty of good locomotives, but he had a habit of being at the extreme end of things, where either what he made would be really, really awful and just not work, whether it be too ahead of the times or what, or be phenomenal, just amazing. And the Q1 definitely falls in the latter category, because this thing is small, light, and it's only a 060, so it's not a large locomotive by any means, but this thing could pull. It was designed and manufactured during World War II, so supplies were limited. Bulleid had to produce a new locomotive, but he couldn't utilize a lot of the materials that would normally go into it, so he had to work around it. It resulted in a lot of innovative measures to minimize weight and maintenance, but also maximize potential. And the Q1's tractive effort, for its size, was insane. When they were introduced, they surprised everybody by being able to handle 97% of the railway's trains unaided. And it's considered the most powerful 060 ever to run on a British rail line. So good, in fact, that despite being produced during the war and only meant to be a temporary measure to keep things rolling, they were used until the end of steam in the 60s. And one saw itself into preservation. Southern C1 is currently on display at the National Railway Museum in New York. And before that, it actually worked on the Bluebell Railway. Not bad for an engine that wasn't supposed to outlast World War II. The General Electric Evolution Series. Man, I love that name. I was a big fan of Dash 8s and Dash 9s. I always like wide-body diesel cabs because, you know, for us over here in America, it just screams USA, USA, USA! They're big and intimidating and powerful, and the Evolution series kind of stands as a crowning point for the future of American railroading. They were actually only put into production because of our Environmental Protection Agency's Tier 2 locomotive emissions standards that took effect in 2005. It made a lot of older model diesels no longer fit the legal criteria. But General Electric really hit it out of the ballpark with these things because not only did they cut down on emissions to meet the EPA's new standards, but they preserved and in some ways improved on the diesel's tractive effort and overall power output. They're good. And in fact, in the January 2009 issue of Trains magazine, it was named as one of the 10 locomotives that changed railroading. And it was the only locomotive introduced after 1972 to be included on that list. So I'm not the only one that thinks the Evolution series are phenomenal, and they're likely to continue serving on American railroads for years to come. The British Rail Class 43, the high-speed train. I hate you. I hate you so much. Are you serious? Are you seriously doing this to me? I just spent 10 lists talking about you. And now that I moved on to better things to make myself happy, you have put yourself in front of me yet again. And I'm sure many of the people who are watching are saying, can you talk about the diesel? I have a lot of questions. You know what? I got a lot of questions too. For instance, how dare you? The British Rail Class 43 high-speed train, which should not be confused with the Class 43 warship class, because those Class 43s were totally different and actually appeared in my Worst Of series, whereas this Class 43, which was produced after the original Class 43 and just filled in absently since Class 43 was available, is not bad. Quite the opposite. This is one of the best diesels British Rail ever made. And I know so far on this channel, I've set that bar super de-duper low. I recognize that. But even at the standards that the General Electric Evolution just set for us, These things are good. They've been in service since 1976 and are still in service on railways all over the UK. And officially, it's considered the fastest diesel locomotive in the world, with a maximum speed of 148 miles per hour, or 238 kilometers an hour. They're a Bobo configuration, and they were produced by the British Rail Engineering Limited, which, again, I know I've set a low standard for that name, but man, did they really hit it out of the park in their game of cricket whenever they were working on this one. Are there home runs in cricket? Is that a thing? I don't actually know how to play cricket. I can play baseball. I'm an American. I know nothing about cricket other than the fact that it's a little bit similar. And it involves a stick and a ball, and that's about all I got for you. Look, anyway, the Class 43 is phenomenal. So good. And well loved by UK rail fans as I understand it. They've received a lot of life extension improvements since their introduction, and according to what I've read, it seems like every time they went to replace them, the replacements just were never as good. 43s stuck around, despite a lot of other classes coming and going. They're still working, out there right now on the lines, and I'm sure if you live in the UK, you've probably seen them at one point or another. So okay, British Rail, I'm not fond of talking about you again, but you win this round. This is a good one. Good work, guys. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class G5. Now I'm back to what's familiar. The G5s were produced in the Penzie shops in Juniata in the mid to late 1920s, and they survived until the 50s. These things are great. From the get-go, the Pennsylvania Railroad was looking for power, but at the time they didn't want to make necessarily a massive engine because they needed something that was still small enough to work on most of their lines. So the result was the G5s. They're technically 10-wheelers, one of the most prevalent and successful wheel arrangements for a steam locomotive ever, but these things are not your average 10-wheeler. Their tractive effort and overall power output was ludicrous for an engine of their type. And because of how efficient a 10-wheeler tends to be, their acceleration was also good too, and they were very efficient. The only downside of these is that many crews found them a little rough to ride. They weren't very smooth, but that sort of thing was considered acceptable for every good thing it did, which was everything else. And though they were retired in 1955, 3 of them did survive into preservation, so you're still able to go see them if ever you want to. And that's always nice to hear. The Electric Motive Diesel SD40-2. Yeah, I feel like I've mentioned this in the past, but it's a little hard to compete with the SD40-2 in railroad history. And I'm not just talking about America, but I'll start there. Built as an improvement to the original SD40s, though they technically had lower horsepower than a lot of other locomotives on the market, they more than made up for it in reliability and versatility. The fact that they could be used for a lot of different jobs and could be expected to run with minimum maintenance meant that they were incredibly popular, purchased by multiple different corporations, not just in America, but internationally. They've served in Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and even the UK, but I bet you didn't realize it was an SD40. British Rail Class 59, as my UK audience may be more familiar with, is effectively just an SD40-2 with some outward modifications to meet UK standards. And in fact, these were the first diesel locomotives to work for British Rail that were built in the United States. Other countries all over the world, from Yugoslavia to South Korea to Iran, Morocco, Peru, Pakistan, almost everywhere with a functional railway had some version of the SD40-2s imported because they were just so reliable. And if that in itself doesn't make it one of the best locomotives ever made, I don't know what does. The EMD GP9. Some people actually called me out for not including this in the first part, and I get you. That's a fair assessment. Built between 1954 and 1959 by General Motors Electromotive Division, the GP9s were a sensational success when it came to American diesel innovation. At a time when most railways were transitioning out of steam and onto diesels, the GP9 helped solidify how good and efficient diesel power could be on the rails. They were built mainly for freight service, but they've seen uses all over the place, across North and South America. Over 4,000 GP9s were produced, and many of them are actually still in service, whether it be in their original form, in preservation, or rebuilt. There's multiple different rebuilds of GP9s, such as the GP15Cs, or the GP9RM that are still in use by Canadian National. 23 are officially in preservation in various places, and they're actually used a lot in railroad museums because of their efficiency. Sometimes for excursion trains or just to move stuff around. They're good locomotives, and I think the fact that they're still being used after nearly 70 years should speak for itself. EMD F40PH. Yes, this is another one that people questioned why I didn't include it, and to be honest, it was just too obvious because I've brought this one up before in several different videos because it really turned out to be one of the best diesels ever produced for a variety of reasons. The F40PH started production in 1975, and it was intended for use by Amtrak, but specifically their short-haul passenger routes. These diesels were not meant for long-distance trips because, at the time, Amtrak was introducing the SDP-40Fs, as well as the Pooches, to encompass a long-distance trip role. Except that both of those actually didn't work at all. The P-40Fs couldn't stop trying to run off the rails, and the Pooches broke every 12 seconds of operation. That's an exaggeration, but my point is they broke a lot. They were completely inefficient. So Amtrak was kind of stuck. They'd spent all this money on these diesels, and two of them weren't working. The rest of their fleet was pretty old and sometimes incompatible, and even some of their electric units, the GEE-60s, weren't operating appropriately. Might throw that on the worst of list someday, but we'll talk about that some other time. The point is, the only thing they really had left that they could use was the F40PH, but it wasn't designed for that purpose. Could they really expect it to work long distance? Well, apparently yes. They were exceptional, phenomenal. They easily transitioned into the backbone of Amtrak's passenger network, and they used them for decades. Not only was it a commercial success for Amtrak, but it also became a PR success, as the F40PHs became instantly synonymous with Amtrak. If you saw one, you knew what company it was. They became recognizable as an American mainstay. And in fact, it's arguable that without the F40PH's success, Amtrak may not have lasted, and who knows where the passenger rail network would be in America at this point. This diesel really put in the work when it was needed, but nothing lasts forever, and they did eventually age to the point that Amtrak felt the need to replace them. At first, they supplemented them with General Electric Dash 8s, which are actually great diesels on their own. I might include that on the list someday. And inevitably, the Genesis series, which was of course meant to be the new face of Amtrak. And those have been remarkably successful, don't get me wrong, but it was a shame to see the F40PHs go. Their last run with Amtrak was in 2001 and they were officially retired, but at least 3 entered preservation in America, and some of them are actually still in service, just not with Amtrak. They're currently with Via Rail in Canada. Only recently has Via Rail started phasing their own F40PHs out with more Genesis units that they're getting from Amtrak, but still, the F40PH is still, as of now, on the rails in service, and I think we can call that a win overall. The British Rail Class 8. No. Calm down. Deep breaths, remember what your therapist said. It's only a logo. It's not even really real. It was a corporation. They went defunct. They can't hurt you. It just feels that way. But it's all in your head. Just let it go. Just let it go. Okay. The Class 8 diesel may be a little familiar to some of you, and that is because they are the basis for the Thomas the Tank Engine character, Diesel. Yes, that really was just his name. It really was just called Diesel. They didn't even give him an original name. I mean, at least Boko's name was a little reversed, and Mavis had her own name. I mean, come on, guys. Despite the fact that Diesel may have given you the impression that the Class 8s are evil, because he was kind of a jerk, just all the time, the Class 8s actually were incredibly good at what they did. And in fact, several other classes, the Class 9 and Class 10, were derivatives of the Class 8. The Class 9 had a different gearing system to allow it to be a bit faster, and Class 10 had different engines and transmissions. And in fact, the Class 11s also look very similar, but that's because the 8s were based on the 11s, because they were out of order, and I'm not even worried about it. Anyway, nearly 1,000 of these little devils were produced for British Rail, and there's a good reason for that. Now, they couldn't go very fast, only up to about 15 miles per hour, and that was at the high end. They were not fast at all, but they more than made up for it in significant tractive effort for their size. They were shunters, some of the best shunters that British Railways ever saw. So good, in fact, that they are still in use literally right now. You may think it's weird that I'm putting a British Rail diesel that was built in the 50s or 60s, because I may have given the impression that they never produced anything good during that time. Now, for the most part, that's kind of true. But there are exceptions, as I keep reiterating, and the Class 8's one of those exceptions. These little guys have been a mainstay in every single rail yard all across the UK, and it was only recently that they started dealing down the number of them, because they did make a great deal, like way too many, if we're being honest. A few were exported, but most were scrapped, though 100 still remain in service as of now, with a handful converted to Class 9s or Class 13s. which is another diesel that looks just like these. There's so many of these little box designs. Why do you like those so much? I mean, I guess they work. I can't complain. I mean, I can, but I won't, because they're good. They're good at what they do, and have been continually good at what they've done for 70 years. So full marks where it's due. This is a good diesel that came out of British Railways early in their inception, and that is an achievement that I never thought I'd actually see. And speaking of British rail technology, the London Midland and Scottish Railway Stanier Class 5, also known as the Black Five, created by William Stanier and built between 1934 and 1951. And they made 842 of these things. That is, of course, not to mention the 852 of the Stanier Class 8Fs, which were the freight version of this same locomotive. The Black Fives were an incredible piece of steam technology. Absolutely, without question, one of the best steam locomotives that the UK has ever delivered. They were efficient, they were fast, they were reliable. Crews loved working on them because they were effectively a combination of every single thing that had been learned about steam technology up until that point from the country that had invented the things. They were so good, in fact, that they survived quite literally until the last day of steam on British rail. The Black Fives were so good that even British Rail, that was dead set on getting rid of every steam locomotive on the lines because diesels were so much better, and, you know, everyone was doing that, but British Rail kept making bad diesels. It was kind of annoying when they did it. The Black Fives were the last to go. In fact, the Black Fives made up the majority of the steam locomotives that British Rail was still using at 151. Second place went to their freight version, the 8Fs, at 150. That's right, even British Rail, again, dead set on getting rid of steam, felt the Black Fives were worth keeping around for a significant amount of time. Based on that alone, I'd argue that the Black Fives are bare minimum one of the best, if not the best, steam locomotives that the UK ever made. Which is my opinion as an American. Maybe you disagree. But the point is, they were awesome. And at least 18 are still preserved, some in running condition. And so if you're ever in the UK, you might be able to see one and even ride on one. And that's something. The Union Pacific Big Chunk, big boy. The Union Pacific Big Boy. Am I biased to put the Big Boy, which only had 25 of it ever produced, over the Black Five as an American? Is that just me doing that? I mean, these lists are dubious in terms of their order anyway. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. It's just the Big Boy is, well, it's the Big Boy. And honestly, I got called out for not including it in the first part of this, but I tried to avoid it because even I will admit that I like the Big Boy, love the Big Boy. It's an astonishing piece of steam technology. I just think it's a little overrated, and it's probably the most famous American-made steam locomotives ever created, despite being rather few in number. But what Big Boy lacked in quantity, it makes up for in legacy. The Big Boy was, well, big, huge, enormous, and every time it's been in operation, it has held the record for the largest and most powerful operating steam locomotive in the world. And in fact, it reclaimed its title in May of 2019 when Big Boy number 4014 was restored to operational condition by Union Pacific and did some excursion services. And that was immensely successful. Everybody liked that. Okay, everyone liked that. That was awesome. Historically, there has been some debate over the Big Boy's record standing because some will tell you that the H8 Alleghenies, remember the one that blew up, were actually heavier than the Big Boy. But according to my sources, that was actually checked by both the manufacturer and the railroad, found that the Big Boys did outweigh the H8 Alleghenies by, like, a little bit. They were close. Very, very close. Also, historically, I have completely screwed up talking about the Big Boys every time I have discussed them, which is the other reason why I was hesitant to put them on the list, because I have called these things the wrong thing twice. And that hurts me more than it hurts you. I'm all about facts here. I like to get things right, and when I get it wrong, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. So let's actually, for the love of everything, correct my errors of the past. Because the first thing I did, well, it happened when I talked about the triplex locomotive. And I compared it to a Big Boy, basically explaining, well, that's a duplex locomotive. That's wrong. They are not. Big Boys are simple, articulated 4884 steam locomotives. Why is it different from a duplex? Well, because duplexes are not articulated. They're in a rigid frame, whereas the Big Boy is not like that. So that was wrong. That was the first thing I did. But then I found another source. I'm like, okay, well, what exactly are the big boys? And this source said, oh, they're Malays, which I mispronounced as mallet because I'm an American and there's a T there. I'm sorry. And that's also wrong, because even though Malays are articulated, they utilize a compound steam system, where the main boiler steam is fed to the first set of driving wheels, and then the exhaust steam from those is sent to the other set. The big boy doesn't work like that at all. The big boy is simple articulated. It just feeds the steam to its wheels. So that was wrong too. I am so sorry to have screwed that up, and I hope now we can move past it, because I am an imperfect creature. And I am sorry, big boy. You deserve better. But like I said, it has received better, because while only 25 were produced, they didn't really need that many of them. These things could pull long, heavy freight trains alone, without any kind of issues. In fact, they were specifically designed to avoid having to double head, namely use more than one locomotive. They just wanted one engine that could do it, and the big boys sure could. But what really sets the big boy apart, I think, from a lot of other steam locomotives is legacy. Everyone knows about the big boy. Even non-rail fans can sometimes acknowledge what a big boy is because it was enormous, it was famous, it stood out, and still stands the test of time. A total of 8 survived in the preservation, including 4014, which is in operation. Especially one of this size, because generally speaking, there's a reason why you don't see a lot of enormous steam locomotives on heritage railways. They're a pain. They take up so much room and they're expensive to run. But because Union Pacific decided to do it themselves, because this was their big baby boy, there's actually a running big boy locomotive out there on the rails. And that's a win for rail fans everywhere, if you ask me. The Denver and Rio Grande Western K36 class. These are funny ones, because while they're technically Mikados, which we've discussed before, 282s, these are narrow gauge, teeny tiny little engines. The gauge they run on specifically is 3 foot, or 914 millimeters. And they were manufactured by Baldwin and shipped to the Rio Grande in 1925, and they were first used on the Monarch Branch and Marshall Pass. Only 10 were ever produced, but make no mistake, these were exceptional little locomotives, especially for their size. The Rio Grande Railroad was never exactly known for its, shall we say, stability in terms of rail layouts, tight turns, rough riding, steep grades, but the K36s were exceptional at all of this, being remarkably successful for both passenger and freight service, and stable on rough rails. And in fact, they're so good that out of the 10, 9 are still around in preservation. The only one was never preserved was number 485, and that's because it suffered an accident with a turntable pit in 1955. The rest, however, are all still around, and all but one of the preserved are still in operational condition, which is insane. You could actually go and ride on a train pulled by one of these locomotives right now if you wanted to, and that's pretty amazing if you think about it. Like, how often can you say that out of all the locomotives of this type that were built, 90% were preserved? I know it's only out of 10, but still, that's very impressive. The DB Class 103, also known as Bohio Run 03s, these are electric locomotives that were manufactured in Germany by, as you might have expected, Deutsche Bundesbahn? I believe is how you say that? Yes? Yes? No? Points for trying? Okay, whatever. Development started in the 1950s, and the first 4 prototypes were put into service in 1965. Initially, they were presented to the public at the... Oh dear. Okay, that translates to International Transport Fair, but once again, Germany is forcing me to pronounce this because otherwise my followers will never forgive me. International Verkehrsstellung, I think, is how you say that. I don't know. Don't yell at me. Throughout the testing of the prototypes, it was discovered that they were a little bit underpowered. But by the time they got the first production models in service, they were in fact excellent. And these were phenomenal electric locomotives capable of very high speeds. And believe me, the railway worked these locomotives very hard. They could have gone over 620 miles, or 1,000 kilometers, a day, which is very high even for a locomotive. They were also capable of at least 120 miles per hour, or 200 kilometers per hour. Although there weren't that many places on the rail network where they could reach that speed, the point is, they could do it. And that was only with the initial runs. Later models would actually increase that top speed up to 174 miles per hour, 280 kilometers per hour. But they performed admirably for most of their lives, and in fact, it wasn't until they started being phased out in favor of the newer Class 101s that the 103s started developing problems, because the lower speeds meant that they were stopping and starting more, and it actually caused them to wear faster. They were finally completely withdrawn in 2003. 17 of the Class 103s have been preserved. At least 5 of them are still in operating condition, and in fact 2 of them are technically still in service. The Deutsche Bundesbahn still utilized them as testers, which just goes to show how good they were, especially for their time. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class K4. Yeah, this is one I got a lot of requests for, and yeah, I know, I know, believe me, I know. The K4s are a Pacific-type locomotive 462, constructed by Baldwin as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works, and it was their premier passenger-hauling steam locomotive from 1914 right up until the end of steam on the railroads in 1957. The K4s were good for their time and lasted, and were a regular sight among the Penzies lines. In fact, I'd argue they pretty much represent everything about steam on the Pennsylvania Railroad. I mean, generally when people think the Pennsylvania Railroad and steam locomotives, you probably envision a K4, because they were just so common. 425 were manufactured, and were utilized for over 40 years. Attempts were made to replace them with the K5, which didn't work out too well, as well as the T1, which may have worked out eventually, but by that point the Pennsylvania Railroad just decided to go with diesels anyway, so unfortunately the T1 never really got a chance to work out its growing pains. But the K4s are a legendary part of American railroad history, and in fact they're Pennsylvania's official state steam locomotive, which I did not even realize was a thing until, well, I started doing research for this very video. 2 of them did last into preservation, fortunately. Number 3750 is on outdoor static display at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. And number 1361 is, well, technically preserved, and was actually in operation in Altoona until 1987, but persistent bearing problems ended that. It was eventually moved to the Steamtown National Historic Site, but it was disassembled and then laid in pieces for 22 years, until the project to actually restore it was officially abandoned in 2010. In 2018, a group of preservationists wanted to put it back together and actually put it back into service. They are making a bit of progress on it, but it's slow going, and the project is apparently supposed to cost a total of $2.6 million because they have to build a whole new boiler for the thing, which sounds like a grand old time. But hey, the K4s were great, either way. The Union Pacific Challenger. This is another one I got a ton of requests for, because the second I mentioned the big boy, I got a bunch of people being like, oh, hey, you didn't mention the Challenger, which is the big boy's brother, and actually came before the big boy, and yeah, how dare you not, look, the big boy's more famous. I'm sorry, they were bigger, but there were a lot more of the Challengers. In total, Union Pacific built 105 of them, and apparently 6 were produced by Denver and Rio Grande Western, and the Challengers, despite being smaller than the big boys, that doesn't really say a lot, because they were still 4.664s. They're not exactly dwarfed by big boys by any stretch of the imagination, and you could argue they were actually a lot more useful. Constructed by Alco to be, well, powerful, they were smaller than big boys, which meant they were a lot more flexible in terms of which lines they could operate on. Yeah, they were huge, but they weren't huge enough to be a hindrance, which for some rail fans actually makes them a lot more likable, because they're still big enough to be impressive, but small enough to actually be utilized for a lot more purposes. The Challenger could actually handle tight turning, and to be honest deserves a place in railroad history just as much as the big boy does. However, unfortunately, there's only 2 of the Challengers preserved, which is less than the big boy saw, even though there were more Challengers made. Number 3977 is currently on display at Cody Park, North Platte in Nebraska. 3985 was actually restored by Union Pacific themselves in 1981 and was used for excursions. Yeah, they did the excursion service thing with their old steam locomotives well before they did it with the big boy number 4014. The problem was 3985 started suffering from mechanical problems in 2010, and that forced it from service as being too expensive to repair. Instead, Union Pacific decided to restore big boy number 4014 and use that for their excursion services instead. And as of now, 3985 is still at the Union Pacific Railroad shops in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where it will probably remain for the foreseeable future. But don't feel too upset. The tender of 3985 was actually given to 4014. Yeah, 3985's tender is currently being used by 4014. That's the same tender. So at least a part of the Challenger lives on with 4014. The British Rail Class 37. This is weird for me. Is it weird for you? I don't know what to say about any of this. I'm talking about good trains, and I know you've been on this a few times, but this one was from the 60s. This was the time. This is a diesel electric. This is the exact thing you failed miserably at. But they were built between 1960 and 65, and somehow they weren't completely screwed up. Built as a part of the modernization plan, which is usually a red flag, the Class 37, nicknamed tractors by railway enthusiasts because their motors are actually very similar to normal tractors, at a time when every other diesel on the line that wasn't a Class 8 or some derivative of it was failing miserably, the 37s stood out and stepped up to the plate and became one of the most successful diesels on the lines then and to present day. They've gone through revisions and remodels and alterations to change up the kind of work they could do, but ultimately it's still all back to that initial design of the Class 37. And both British Railways, as well as the new privatized railways, have struggled to find a way to properly replace them even after so long of them being in service. The first attempt to withdraw them was back in 1967, and is still technically going on to this day in various capacities, but as I speak right now, 35 are in preservation and 66 are still in service, still being used on the lines. And if that's not a win for the modernization plan, the one shining beacon of hope that British Rail had, their one thing that didn't go completely wrong in the 60s, it was the Class 37, which actually was a very useful engine. Props where it's due, guys. Queensland Railway's C17 class. These locomotives were 480s, sometimes called 12-wheelers because, well, duh. And they were operated by the Queensland Railways in Australia. Built as an improved version of the C16s, they were exceptional locomotives for their era and lasted a significant amount of time. They were continually constructed between 1920 and 1953, and they weren't actually withdrawn until the end of steam on Australia's railways. A total of 227 were produced, and out of those, 25 have been preserved, which is a pretty impressive amount of preservation. Some of them are even still in running condition, so if you've ever been to a heritage railway in Australia, you may have ridden on a train that was pulled by one. British Rail Class 55. Am I a joke to you? I'm just asking. It's a serious question. Constructed by English Electric in 1961 and 1962, the Class 55s are also known as the Deltics, named after their original prototype, the DP1 Deltic. And even though the notion that they were built in the 60s might be a red flag, and it is, much like the Class 37s that we discussed last time, the Class 55s were phenomenal locomotives. And it's an interesting note that English Electric was also responsible for the Class 37s, which leads me to believe that English Electric may have been the only manufacturer in the UK at that time that at least had some sense of what they were doing. The Deltics, at the time of their creation, were actually the most powerful diesel locomotive in the world, with a power output of 3,300 horsepower. They also had an official maximum speed of 100 miles per hour, or 160 kilometers per hour, but it was apparently frequently exceeded, especially in their later years, and they were recorded going 117 miles per hour, or 188 kilometers per hour. And on a downgrade, they could apparently get to 125. Only 22 were ever made, but they were used for express passenger service on the East Coast Main Line. They were incredibly good at their job, and they, along with the 37, stood out among the many horrible diesels that British Rail put into service during their ill-fated modernization plan. But then that leads to the real question, why were they withdrawn at all? The 37s are still in service now. Why were so few of the Deltics built, and why were they withdrawn in the 80s? Well, to begin with, a lot of their work was overtaken in 1978 when the Intercity 125 came into being, which was a train set made up of two Class 43s. The Deltics were put on secondary service, and this made them a lot less efficient overall. Their engines were good, but they were very complicated, requiring specialty maintenance, and their operating costs were considered too high. Additionally, they were non-standard. British Rail was really starting to cut back on the small, non-standard fleets they had, and the Deltics fit right into that category. They were taken out of service, but not immediately. They actually kept using them until they broke, quite literally wearing them down, and only then withdrawing them, choosing not to fix them. Which is kind of a brutal strategy when you think about it. Goodness, British Rail, chill out. But don't worry, the Deltics are actually incredibly popular among British Rail fans, and in fact they've been one of my most requested topics to discuss when it comes to British Rail diesels because, again, they were actually very good. 6 were put into preservation, and there's also 2 cabs sitting around. Most were saved by the Deltic Preservation Society, a non-profit group of enthusiasts that, well, the name kind of implies what they do. They wanted to preserve the Deltics, and succeeded in that. Some are still under maintenance and repair, but one, number 55019, or D9019, which is named Royal Highland Fusilier? Yes? No? That one! It's currently operational, so you might be able to ride in a train pulled by one still. That's always fun. The Norfolk and Western Railway Class J. Constructed during the tail end of steam on American railroads, these 484 Northern Streamline steam locomotives are considered some of the best steam locomotives that America ever produced. The J-Class are famous, having a high-class and handsome design, and considered by many American rail fans as one of the best-looking locomotives ever made. But they weren't all aesthetics. They were powerful, very fast, and they're considered one of the most reliable and efficient steam locomotives ever. In their heyday, they could run as many as 15,000 miles a month, and the Norfolk and Western Railway was mountainous, so they put in a lot of work to get those miles. Sadly, they couldn't outlast the impending dieselization of America's railways. In the late 50s, Norfolk and Western started experimenting with new diesel locomotives. They leased some EMDs, E6s, E7s, and E8s, for testing purposes, and found they were simply cheaper to operate. The Class J's were retired for passenger service, and put on freight service until they were all retired between 1958 and 1959. Only one has survived into preservation, number 611, and 611 has been through it. She's sometimes called the Spirit of Roanoke, as well as the Queen of Steam. She was going to be scrapped along with her sisters, but attorney and railfan W. Graham Clayton Jr. actually managed to convince Norfolk and Western to donate 611 to the Roanoke Transportation Museum in Roanoke, Virginia instead, and she sat on static display for quite a long time. Between 1981 and 1994, she was actually removed from static display by the Southern Railway and put back into service as a part of their steam program. During this time, Norfolk and Western and the Southern Railways would actually merge to form what is now known as Norfolk Southern, and she would continue to do excursion runs until 1994. When that steam program ended, she was sent back to the museum, which is now known as the Virginia Museum of Transportation. She was sent at various places until 2013, when the museum launched a campaign, Fire Up 611, an attempt to raise $3.5 million by the end of October so they could restore 611 to operating conditions. Norfolk Southern themselves actually donated $1.5 million for the job, and she was finally put under steam again in 2015. But she still runs to this day. The Union Pacific FEF Series. Yet another small group of 484 Northern-type steam locomotives. Only 45 were produced, but the FEFs are top-tier steam locomotives, right up there with the aforementioned J-Class. Union Pacific ran these girls really hard. They could put in about 14,000 miles a month, and in particular, they were capable of going 100 miles per hour on the regular, but because they showed up so late towards the end of steam, being built between 1937 and 1944, Union Pacific never really knew how fast the FEFs could go. A former manager of the Union Pacific steam program once commented on them, saying that, although it is stated that the UP FEF series were designed to safely operate at 120 miles per hour, no one really knows how fast the final 484 could go. The last FEF-3 was never actually retired, and he's right. There were several improvements to the FEF model. There was the FEF-1, the FEF-2, and the FEF-3. The FEF-3's potential is debatable. And it's a weird thing for me to read about, because among all the preserved FEFs, there are 4 of them. There's one FEF-1, number 814, there's one FEF-2, number 833, and there are 2 FEF-3s, 838 and 844. Now, 838 generally serves as a set of spare parts for 844, because 844 still serves the Union Pacific Railroad now. No, seriously, unlike all of her sisters and every other steam locomotive on her railway, and pretty much every railway in North America, number 844 was never actually retired. She's served Union Pacific since December 1944 to this day, running excursion services as part of Union Pacific's steam program. And just in case anyone wants to ask, I did look to see if 611 and 844 have ever been in the same place at the same time, and as far as I'm able to tell, no. But it'd be really cool if they were. I'm just saying. Pennsylvania Railroad Class GG1. Ah, here we are. Here we go. This is one of my biggest requests for the list, and I'll be real, you didn't have to request it. I know. These are one of my favorite classes of locomotives. GG1s are legendary. Built between 1934 and 1943, 139 GG1s were produced, and they were phenomenal. They entered service in 1935 and weren't retired until 1983. 48 years of service the GG1s put in. And for electric locomotives, that's a substantial achievement. They were massive pieces of equipment and capable of pulling a significant amount of weight and looking good while doing it. There are probably other examples of other electric locomotives that could do what the GG1s did technically better, but the GG1 is iconic. It has a legacy here. It became synonymous with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Along with the K4s, the GG1s were one of the most common sight on their lines. Out of all the GG1s, 15, as well as the original prototype, were put into preservation, although none are operational. The reason for this is that the main transformers of the GG1s used PCBs in the insulating oil, which are violently toxic and had to be disposed of due to safety concerns. Plus the fact that they're so big and require pantograph lines that it's hard to find a place to use them effectively anymore. Even if you could rebuild one to work with modern equipment, it would still be a significant undertaking and very expensive. At this point I expect them to stay on static display, but at least they have that. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.